My GP told me my inflammation was fine, normal range, nothing to worry about. I believed him for years until I found out that normal and optimal are two completely different things. And what I did about it changed more than just one blood test result. Because normal covers a lot of ground. It means you haven't crossed a threshold. It doesn't mean you're where you want to be. And when I started understanding what chronic inflammation was actually doing in my body, quietly over years, I realised I'd been given permission to stay somewhere I shouldn't have been staying. I'm Neil. I've been tracking my NHS blood results since 2012, 13 years of data. In the next 14 minutes, I'll show you what inflammation actually looks like in a long-term data set, what my gut health markers told me about where it was coming from, and what happened to both when I spent 18 months deliberately fixing the inputs. And if your GP has ever told you something is fine without explaining what fine actually means, this video is worth your time. 3 things. First, what the inflammation markers actually measures and why being in the normal range told me almost nothing useful about whether I was improving or declining. Second, the gut health number that came back in the same blood test and what it confirmed about the connection between what I was eating and what was happening in my blood. And third, what I changed, what I tracked, and what the data showed over the following 3 months. We'll start not with a blood test, but with a question my GP had never actually asked me. The question my GP never asked was this: what's causing it? Not is it high, not does it need medication, what is actually driving the number? Because CRP, C-reactive protein, which is the inflammation marker you'll see on a standard NHS blood panel, is a signal, not a cause. It tells you fire is somewhere in the building. It doesn't tell you where the fire started or what's feeding it. And for years, I didn't know either. The number sat in the low end of normal. GP said fine. I said fine. Neither of us looked at what was upstream of it. Will Bulsiewicz is a gastroenterologist, gut specialist, New York Times bestselling author, Zoe collaborator. His framing changed how I thought about this entirely. He says the gut microbiome isn't just connected to the immune system. It is the first line of immune defense. The immune system is actually the third line. First, your gut microbes. Second, the gut lining. And third, the immune system itself. So if you're asking why inflammation exists and you haven't looked at what's happening in the gut first, you've skipped lines 1 and 2 entirely. Here's what that looks like in practice. Think of your gut lining as the cellar door of a pub. Below the cellar, your intestines breaking down food, sorting what's useful. Above it, the bar, your bloodstream where nutrients arrive properly processed in clean glasses ready to use. When that cellar door is intact, only the right things come through. But when the lining gets damaged from ultra-processed foods, seed oils, chronic stress, repeated antibiotic use, gaps form. And now things are coming through that shouldn't. Undigested food particles crossing into the bloodstream, bacterial fragments getting upstairs. The bouncer, your immune system, goes absolutely mental trying to deal with it, mounting a response to everything. Inflammation everywhere, persistent, low level, and almost completely invisible on a blood test until it's been going on for years. That's not a dramatic sudden event, that's a door that's been quietly rotting. Tim Spector's team, including the landmark Stanford RCT, took this further and tested what happens when you fix the inputs. 36 participants, 2 groups, one eating 5 daily portions of fermented food, one eating a high fibre diet, 6 weeks. The fermented food group showed a significant decrease in 19 inflammatory proteins, including interleukin-6, which is one of the key markers in systemic inflammation. Not a modest dip, a measurable immune system shift. First human study to clearly demonstrate this effect. The high fibre group, useful, but not the same response. Now think about your gut microbiome like the Friday night pub. You want regulars from all walks of life. Builders, teachers, pensioners, students, people who've been coming for decades. That diversity is what makes the pub resilient. If the students leave town, one bacterial strain dies off, the pub doesn't collapse because there are still builders and pensioners holding things together. Monoculture gut is a student-only pub. Term ends. Everyone goes home. The landlord goes bust. Western diets have been running student-only pubs for 30 years. Ultra-processed food feeds a narrow group of bacterial strains, the ones that thrive on sugar, refined carbs and additives. The rest of the regulars gradually stop coming. Diversity collapses. Resilience goes with it. The immune system, now working off a depleted first line of defence, starts over-responding to things that it shouldn't. That's chronic low-level inflammation, and it's linked to virtually every common disease, from depression to type 2 diabetes, from arthritis to cardiovascular disease to certain cancers. Why it matters, and this is worth being clear about, is that this mechanism doesn't switch on at a diagnosis. It builds over years. Gut diversity declining quietly, barrier integrity gradually weakening, CPR drifting upwards but staying in range. Someone in their late 30s or 40s might be running this process for a decade before a GP flags anything. The mechanism is the same whether you've had a diagnosis or not. One more downstream effect worth naming. There's a thick cable running from your gut to your brain, the vagus nerve. Your gut sends more signals up to your brain than your brain sends down. Around 90% of serotonin, the mood regulator, is made in your gut, not your brain. So when the gut's inflamed, when the pub is half empty, when the cellar door is leaking, the factory floor is producing less of everything that the boardroom needs. Energy, mood, focus, appetite regulation. It all runs on what the gut produces. Fix the factory and you're not just fixing a blood test number. The common misconception worth addressing here is that inflammation is always something you can feel. It isn't. Chronic, low-level inflammation, the kind that sits in the lower half of normal on a blood test, doesn't usually announce itself with pain or swelling. It runs silently. Fatigue that doesn't shift, joints that feel a bit older than they should, a mood that's harder to lift than it used to be, digestion that's functional but never quite right. These aren't dramatic symptoms, they're background noise, and most people reasonably attribute them to ageing. They're not ageing, they're inputs. I want to tell you about a decision I made about 10 days after finishing a long fast. I'd just come off an extended water fast, January 2024. Before it, I'd set myself a specific goal. The refeed wasn't just going to be about food. It was going to be about deliberately rebuilding my microbiome. I'd read the Spectre research. I understood the gut inflammation connection in theory. I wanted to test it in practice against my own numbers. So within 10 days of refeeding, I made 20 new fermented food recipes. 20 kimchi, sauerkraut variations, kefir, different ferments with different bacterial profiles. Some were ready that week, some needed another week. That first taste, slightly sour, tangy, and live in a way that mass-produced food isn't. It felt like I was doing something right. Digestion stayed calm throughout. The idea behind all of it was microbiome diversity. 20 different fermented foods means 20 different bacterial strain profiles arriving in the gut in a concentrated window. Not just quantity, variety. Tim Spector's Friday Night Pub needed rebuilding from a student-only establishment into something with a proper crowd. And alongside that, I changed how I was getting plant diversity in day-to-day. Here's the practical things I found. You can hit 15 different platinum points in a single bowl of soup before you've even started your eating window. 30 plants a week sounds ambitious until you realise that herbs count, spices count, different coloured vegetables count, pulses count. A pot of soup, leeks, carrots, celery, onion, garlics, lentils, 3 different herbs, tin of tomatoes, black pepper. That's 10 right there. Make it properly and you're at 12 or 14. 15 before noon is genuinely achievable. And it completely changes your relationship with the 30 plant target. That was the idea. Fermented foods daily, diversity through soups as the primary delivery mechanism, and reduced UPF, which if you want to stop pouring acid on the cellar door, is probably the most important single thing. The blood test came back on the 8th of January 2025. CRP 6.2, down to 1 on this one. That's an 84% reduction. Calprotectin, a gut-specific inflammation marker, came back at under 5. normal upper limit is 10. It wasn't just in range, it was near zero. ALT, which is the liver enzyme I'd watched drift elevated for a while, 69 back in December 2023, came down to 29 in January 2025, then 23 in April 2025. 3 markers, all pointing in the same direction. Not a single one of them adjusted by medication. I'll be honest about what I don't know. I can't isolate which part of this drove which result. The fasting, the fermented foods, the plant diversity, the reduction in UPF, they were all running simultaneously. What I can say is that the mechanism Tim Spector describes in the research is exactly what I saw in my data. Fix the inputs, rebuild the plug. The blood results follow. The timeline is worth being realistic about. January 2025 was roughly 13 months after I started doing all of this from December 2023. The CRP reading and comparing it to was from the same period. It didn't shift in 3 weeks. It shifted over more than a year of consistent inputs, with the extended fast and microbiome rebuild acting as what felt like an accelerant in the final phase. What the mechanism I tracked in my data suggests, and this isn't unique to my situation, is that the gut inflammation connection runs before symptoms appear and before numbers get flagged. My CRP was in normal range for years while this process was presumably running. The interesting thing isn't the number at the end, it's how early in the process it was already happening. If you're at the stage where you're asking questions before things get serious, this is what this channel's for. Real data, real GP conversations, properly documented. Subscribe if you want to follow it properly. Right, 3 things you can actually start this week. First, the soup strategy for plant diversity. Forget counting 30 plants across a whole week as some abstract target. Start with 1 bowl of soup. Pick 8 to 10 different vegetables and add a couple of pulses, throw in 3 or 4 different herbs and spices. You've got 12, 13, 14 or 15 plant points in one single meal. Do that once a day before your eating window or as your first proper food or as a lunch, and you're hitting 15 plants before you've had dinner. 30 in a week almost becomes automatic. This isn't a recipe prescription, it's a framework. Whatever veg you've got, whatever's in the cupboard, the diversity is the point, not the specific ingredients. Second, 1 fermented food every day. Not a supplement, not a pill. Shop bought sauerkraut, kefir, kimchi, live yogurt. 1 portion daily. The Zoe study used shop bought fermented foods and got a measurable immune response in 3 weeks. This doesn't need to be expensive or complicated. A tablespoon of sauerkraut alongside your soup, a small glass of kefir. That's it, daily. Consistency matters more than specific type. Or, like me, make it yourself. Third, track it, then test it. If you've had a CRP reading before, even one from a general blood panel, you have a baseline. Tell your GP you want to understand the trend, not just the single number. Ask for a repeat at 3 months or 6 months if you're actively changing your diet. Calprotectin can also be requested if you have any digestive concerns. It's a more specific gut inflammation marker and it came back in my NHS panel as part of a broader review. The timeline expectation. 3 weeks for early immune shifts, according to the Stanford data. 3 months for meaningful blood test comparison. 6 to 12 months for sustained microbiome rebuilding. This isn't a detox, it's a long-term input change. If you're on immunosuppressant medication, speak to your GP before significantly increasing fermented food intake. There are interactions worth checking. If you've had gut surgery, inflammatory bowel disease, or a diagnosed condition like Crohn's, the general guidance here doesn't apply. Your situation is specific and needs specific advice. Fermented foods are safe for most people, but start gradually. If your gut is currently irritable, introduce 1 new food at a time. Your gut will tell you if you've moved too fast. I've built a gut health tracker. Logs your daily plant count, fermented food intake, and connects it to your fasting window, so you can see the whole picture in one place. The link's in the description and it's free. And if you want to go deeper on exactly how I approached this last 18 months, the fasting structure, the specific fermented recipes, the blood test timeline, that's in the 7-day fasting blueprint, also linked below. This is educational content only. It's not medical advice. Please speak to your GP before changing your fasting pattern, diet or medication, especially if you're on immunosuppressants, diabetes medication or blood pressure medication.